Hi there, how are you? I'm doing real well. And today we're going to look a little bit at two theorists, Charlotte Perkins Gilman and W.E.B. Du Bois. And these are different theorists than the theorists that we've looked at in the last several sets of slides, because these are theorists who are focused on different kinds of concerns. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a woman, and W.E.B. Du Bois was an African American man. And that means that this chapter is all about, as it says, the challenges of gender and race. And if you think about what we've been looking at, the concerns of some of the earlier theorists we discussed, those two things didn't really come into play so much for the theories that they created. So this is a question about what should be the focus of sociological theory, and how can theory cover some things and maybe hide other things that other theorists can then investigate, find out, and develop. And it also talks a little bit in your Allen book about how the social project of modernity was based in part on the belief and value of equality. And I would say it is and it isn't. To some extent, in the United States, you could say we value freedom more than equality. And of course, this chapter is all about investigating the extent to which we don't really have equality in the United States. It's more, in some very real ways, about inequality. Let's take a look at our first theorist, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Her life there, you can see she lived 75 years, a long time for some of the theorists that we've considered. And she was a very productive writer. She was a poet, a novelist. She wrote nonfiction pieces, and she was a social reformer. As I have noted here, she wrote over 2,000 works in her lifetime, so very prolific. When she was a child, her mother was not very affectionate, and her father left her family that she was in growing up. And her adult life was also not easy. It was, as Allen says, marked with difficult, tumultuous personal relationships. So she married, had a child, and began suffering from depression after that child was born, and ended up writing a piece that's used around the country. It's very popular in feminist studies classes and English literature classes, called The Yellow Wallpaper, which is all about a woman who has a child and wants to be creative and write, and is told by her doctor not to do that. And this idea of the yellow wallpaper sort of closing in on her, a feeling that she really is not allowed to, her thoughts are not to be validated. And that's a sad story, but it's something, again, that's become used throughout the country in different classes. She got divorced in 1894, which was very rare at the time, and as I said, wrote prolifically over the course of her life. She had a number of affairs with women, but eventually married her cousin, and that lasted from 1900 until her death. So in some ways, perhaps the most stable relationship she had in her life. She committed suicide in 1935 when she found out that she had cancer. Gilman, in some ways, is similar to Herbert Spencer in the way that she developed her theory. They have some overlap. And your text mentions that Gilman is an evolutionist and also a humanist. But the evolutionist part, let's look at a little bit. This idea, it says, humans gradually develop social organization beyond its natural base. Human beings move from simple to complex systems with various elements chosen through the mechanism of survival of the fittest. So again, that's very much aligned with Herbert Spencer. She thought that domestic life was oppressive for women, and that you can see pretty well articulated in that piece, The Yellow Wallpaper, that she wrote. Gilman had some fascinating ideas about human evolution. And she argued that humans gradually developed this social organization we have today beyond, again, our natural needs. Again, you could see this as a little bit like some of the theories we've talked about. We start with these natural needs, but because of our human capacities for creative work, we can move beyond those and create more complex systems. So as human social organization grew, Gilman argues that humans move away from the natural needs, concerns that they have, and they grow more interested and concerned with their social and cultural environment. Gilman saw the exclusion of women from the economy in evolutionary terms. So what does that mean? Women have been excluded from economic life through evolutionary development. And she outlines an argument. She says that men have a sort of natural energy which is more aggressive, and I have it down here as well, that men have hunter, fighter skills, more physical prowess, you could argue. That's how Gilman saw it. And she saw women's domesticity. Again, she's arguing that women have a natural orientation toward child rearing and developing a good home life. These two different orientations once were adaptive for what she calls the race, what we would today refer to as the species. So this different orientation is good. However, she also insightfully sees self-preservation and race preservation, or again, species preservation, as potentially at odds. Now, how can I communicate or clarify this? That just because it is good for the species, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good system for some of the individuals within that species. So here's the idea, is that women, they might not be necessarily benefiting from this continuation of the species in a particular way. So their self-preservation, the idea that women might be capable of doing more and that they might be oppressed, their self-preservation can be at odds with the preservation and continuation of the entire species. If they're being held to a different standard and a diminished set of life chances. In pre-dawn history, Gilman argues that the two sexes joined in monogamy, a relationship where there's only one spouse. And she argues that this led to patriarchy, or male dominance. And patriarchy, patri, means father, archy means like a system of rule. So patriarchy literally means the rule of the father. How did this come about? Gilman again saw these natural female-male energies, that men naturally were oriented towards certain activities, women were naturally oriented toward others. As I said a minute ago, men had things like hunter-fighter skills. However, those skills are not necessarily very pro-social, right? They're rooted in a kind of a conflict, an ongoing conflict. So she argued that those skills, even though they were useful at one point in our evolution, they're no longer adaptive as we've continued to evolve. So she borrows an idea from a sociologist named Lester Ward, and it's a term, it's a bit of a mouthful, gynecocentric theory. And what is gynecocentric theory? It's a notion that women are really at the base of humanity. They're the most essential aspect of our species. So for Ward, he said women are the general race type, which again you can translate into the core needed component of our species. Whereas men are secondary, they are a sex type, they're a variation of the essential species type, which is women. And so this puts men in a kind of a strange position. Men don't have that close bond with their child that women have. So what do men do in order to ensure that they are part of the social order and needed? They have to use patriarchy to create a clear social bond to the child. So a pattern of lineage where the father is seen as very important. This is a social construct that Gilman investigates. And again, male energy, like I said up above, based on conflict and physical prowess, can be seen as fairly at odds with social organization. So men develop patriarchy, according to Gilman, to secure a place in social life through the economic subjugation of women and kids. Now, what does that mean? Subjugation means like a holding down or oppressing. Men create economic systems which make women and children dependent on them. So this system, again, creates the subjugation of women and children. They become economically dependent on men because men control what's called the public sphere. Women are left to control what's called the private sphere, home and domestic life. So that's how men have created their necessity in social relationships through this period, or this idea of a dominating structure. Gilman says that we are at a point now, though, where we can get past that. And she says that women really shouldn't resent what she sees as this past domination by men. But we all need to recognize that now the dysfunctions of the system outweigh the functions. In other words, this bifurcation and male domination is no longer efficient for humanity. It's going to hold us back. We will not be able to evolve if we maintain that social system. And a very nice theoretical move comes from this, that she argues women's movements are the next stage, really, in human evolutionary development. In order for our species to evolve, women's movements, women's rights movements, need to come to the fore. Also, Gilman looks at what she calls the sexuo-economic effects, and this is a tricky idea. Let me unpack it. It's the overlap between sexual spheres and economic spheres. So spheres that you could argue are separate are actually overlapping and interacting with each other. And this is something where you see a back and forth, kind of a dialectic, these things working together. How do the sexual and economic spheres work together? Gilman says women's dependency on men makes what should be these separate spheres, again, intertwine and overlap. How does that happen? Again, women are dominated, subjugated by men. And so their sexuality has to play out within this oppressive system. And that creates for Gilman a morbid excess in sex distinction. She argued, and again you have to think about the time period in which she was making her theory. She argued that women's basic economic skill was in attracting a good earner, attracting a powerful man. So this idea meant that women, in a sense, have to become alienated from themselves. They have to do things which oppress them. So women, for Gilman, are becoming attractive to men through practices that are involved in debilitation. And if you think about this, you can see it all around you. High heels, women who wear high heels, that prevents those people from being able to run very well. It also can damage your feet, as any woman who's over the age of 50 will tell you that high heels hurt and might change your uh, patterns of walking for life. Um, Long nails are not very adaptive for doing things like typing on a keyboard um, and other things. They don't add to women's ability to survive except through this idea of being attractive to men. The idea of being thin. It's a question of who sets that standard. That's a male standard of beauty, that men might want women to be thin, and of course being thin means being frail, fragile, less powerful, less equal. You could even look at some traditional practices like in China, Chinese foot binding for women. That makes women incapable of walking. So this is an interesting theoretical idea. How does this system, which subjugates women, reward women in a sense for debilitating themselves? And along with that, Gilman says that marriage is mercenary. Basically, it's two people out, not in it for each other, but out for themselves. And the economy also is affected by this. It becomes directed toward a feminized market, which focuses on women as domestic consumers and not workers. So the market itself is affected because women are seen as the ones who consume to supply the domestic arena. Men are the workers, women don't work. And Gilman thought this was bad. She said, women, men, we shouldn't become complacent with this arrangement. We can, and that's a problem, is that we can just sort of accept things as they are. That, she says, wouldn't be bad, or would be bad. We need to start seeing it as a problem. And once we do see this as a problem, this subjugation, then we would be able, to overcome it and become all of what our species is capable of. If we become complacent with this oppressive system as it stands, that would undermine human evolution, because for Gilman, that is a system, this system of overlapping socio-economic effects is alienating. It separates women from all that they're capable of being. So again, Kenneth Allen, the author of your textbook, looks at Charlotte Perkins Gilman at a particular point in the book, and this is around after, let's just say, the first few theorists who are called the core theorists of sociology, the earliest social theorists. What's interesting is that you, as an author of a book like Allen is, you can select. You can decide who is important and who is not important. You can choose when to introduce people, if you want to, maybe not at all. And so, in a sense, the choosing of certain theorists for a textbook is a political act. It involves power. And it also involves defining what counts as social theory. And so, if you think about Charlotte Perkins Gilman and the inclusion of this person, who, to be frank with you, I didn't know that much about before reading Allen's book, then you can think, well, how is it that maybe sociological theory itself has changed because of increasing concern with inequality, sex-based inequality, race-based inequality, other forms of inequality that we'll end up talking more about. Now, to continue on that theme of inequality, the next theorist that Allen considers in this same vein, W.E.B. DuBois, and his life was amazingly long and varied. He is American, born in Massachusetts, and he studied under Max Weber for a time. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Fisk, and then he had a bachelor's and a PhD from Harvard. He taught at Atlanta University for 14 years, a decent length career there, and he published many books, but two that are very important. I should say many publications, two books that stand out as very important. One, The Philadelphia Negro, and then this one, which is very, very well known in sociology, and I actually have a copy I can show you, The Souls of Black Folk, which is here. And this is a Barnes and Noble publication, which means that they mass produce these, and so they're used regularly throughout courses in the United States, and it's still in print even though it's over 100 years old. One thing about Du Bois is that he and his ideas are opposed to Booker T. Washington's strategy, which is rooted more in assimilation. And so you can see assimilation as this idea of blending with, and you could see separation or segregation as an idea of separating from. They're two different philosophical approaches to perhaps dealing with a system of inequality. Do you try to blend in and integrate within a system that's unequal and hope to achieve equality? Or do you separate out from that system and try to become best on your own without dealing with that oppressive environment? So again, like I said, Booker T. Washington had a different kind of view. And Du Bois, you know, he changed his mind back and forth a bit as his life continued. One thing he did was he was an activist. He helped found the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he was, again, like I said, an on and off member for many years. Toward the end of his life, though, he became more radical. By 1961, at the age of 93, he joined the Communist Party, and he moved to Ghana. He gave up his U.S. citizenship and moved to Africa, which is a very significant statement about what he felt were the possibilities, or I probably should say the impossibility, of equality happening in his home country. And he died in 1963 in Ghana at the age of 95. And what's amazing to think about with this man is that his birth really is coming after slavery and the Civil War. His death is right around the time of the emergence of the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. He saw an amazing variety of thoughts and ideas and change in the subjugation of African Americans in this country. Du Bois is a unique writer, and as I say there, he writes from a personal perspective, and you can see the use of I statements in his work. And so that's a somewhat unusual thing for a social theorist, especially around this time, because there's a tendency toward more abstraction rather than a personal writing style. And here, for example, I can show you a little bit of how some of these chapters look in his book. You can see that he starts with a quote and then music. There's a little bit of music here that's written out. So he draws from a varied number of different sources. And you can see that here. He produced multimedia text. So they've combined things like irony, prayer, like I said, quotes from articles, other articles, riddles, analogies, declaration, as I said, other approaches, even including pieces of music. And what he's doing, this is a useful thing to consider, is that writing from that personal perspective indicates that if you want to understand a marginal position, then that has to be experienced to be understood. There's a great phrase that nobody understands power as well as the powerless, that people who are oppressed, given a social structure, are the most acutely aware of how power manifests itself through many, many different ways that powerful people don't even necessarily think about or consider. Let's take, for example, if there's an administrative assistant in an office versus the boss of an office. The boss may never consider the fact that nobody reaches across his or her desk, usually his desk, to grab things and take items and whatnot. But quite frequently, administrative assistants work in a communal space where people are constantly taking things from their desk, removing them, putting them back, not treating it as if that's that person's personal space. So again, when you think about this idea of how should we theorize the position of marginal people, he's making an interesting case that a personal perspective is the best way. DuBois believes that African Americans' oppressed position gives them a special insight into America, into the United States and US culture. Again, he's coming from a minority group perspective, and he speaks with I statements as the best way to understand an oppressive environment. And as I said in the previous slide, the people who understand power the best are usually powerless people. So paralleling that, oppressed people see truths that manage to escape the consciousness, really, of more powerful people. And this notion of Du Bois is a precursor to Dorothy Smith's notion of standpoint theory. And we'll talk a lot more about that in a future slide. But in brief, the idea that you can only theorize about something through a particular position or a standpoint. That standpoint informs how you understand a society, a culture, and cultural products. The grand narrative of the United States, it says here, is actually the story of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. What is a grand narrative? Grand narrative means, in maybe simpler terms, the dominant story, the normal, quote-unquote, way that we understand something. So, like, for example, the grand narrative of U.S. history would look at things like, for example, big wars, presidents, the decisions that they made, maybe advances in technology, and it would focus on the history of the dominant group or groups. That's what's often called the grand narrative. And what Du Bois is talking about is saying, well, you know what? That is only one part of the story. U.S. history involves a lot of other groups that don't get represented in that discourse, in that telling. And that means that in some respects this grand narrative is not true. It's a very one-sided story that represents itself as if it's neutral, as if it is capital H history. And that is incorrect. It doesn't include, say, for example, perhaps the contributions of women, the contributions of African Americans to the development of the United States, to the history of this country. And this idea that certain groups are excluded from the general telling of history in the United States, this idea is a precursor to what you could call the salad bowl metaphor of integration in the United States. Now, this is a metaphor of how integration actually works in the United States. The old metaphor, and you've probably heard this, the United States is a melting pot. Now, what does that mean? If you think about a melting pot, it's an analogy or a metaphor that shows different things melting together to kind of a median, a mean point, right? And that is not true if you think about integration in the US. What happens is that the two ends of the spectrum, dominant group and minority group, don't come together to some middle point. The minority groups are strongly encouraged to take on the standards, the values, and the key ideas of the dominant group. And that is seen through many, many things. You can take as an example the notion of if you were to appear religious or present a particular cultural sense of self at a job interview. If you were to come to a job interview, say for example wearing a cross, that is a Western religion, and it might not even be noticed during the job interview as something that is worth pointing out or seeing. If, however, you were to come to a job interview wearing a burqa, that is, even though it's traditional Middle Eastern dress and seen as formal, that would be seen as not normal and probably not something wanted in an American company during a job interview. And so that's what I mean by saying that this melting pot really in some ways is not true. In some ways, maybe it's better thought of in the United States. We have a salad bowl where there are a lot of different groups that may have different ways of being and living in the world. As I said before, and I've paraphrased this earlier, African Americans have systematically been excluded from U.S. history. And that is because history is ideological. There isn't a natural history. History is the product of human beings representing what count as key historic events. Some historic events become more prominent and others are excluded. So this is a fascinating insight because it's all about this notion of representation. Representation, we're going to talk about a bit in the future, which is really a concern with how is meaning given to the world around us. We humans are different from rocks because we use symbols. And those symbols give things meaning that don't necessarily have a direct meaning. And this is where you see the notion of Roland Barthes coming in the chapter. And Barthes has this difference that is useful. Denotative meanings. These are direct meanings. And the example you can think of, something that, for example, could be looked up in an ordinary dictionary. Cultural signs, though, can also have secondary meanings, and those are connotative meanings. And that is this idea that there are meanings attached to something that create a wider field of meaning. Other meanings that are not necessarily the intended or denotative meaning emerge because humans are symbol-using creatures and we make sense of the world in very different ways. One example you can think of with denotative and connotative meanings is what you could call the slippery slope of language and stereotypes. The denotative meaning of mankind, right, is supposed to be men and women, right? That's what it's supposed to be. But if you think about the connotative meaning, you can ask, well, does it represent that for all people? Because it actually has a particular sex embedded in the phrase. And what studies have shown is that when little kids hear things like mankind, the image that pops into their head first is of a male. And so you can say, well, the denotative meaning of this is that it's a neutral way of describing humanity. The connotative way of thinking about it, though, is to say, well, how does that reproduce perhaps sexist language? It reproduces men as dominant, and that system should be taken as normal instead of ideological, instead of a system that humans created. So there's a question about something like mankind or man-made being neutral language or sexist language. And there's a funny thing where a lot of people might take offense when they hear that. They go, oh my gosh, I didn't mean to say anything offensive. I didn't intend that. So this is this notion here. People don't probably intentionally try to discriminate by using such terms. But you can think about how really that happens. It says here, in your text, all men are created equal. There was a 4-man crew on board. The masculine pronoun, is it supposed to be specific or general? And this is why feminist scholars sometimes talk about the invisible woman in history. The double consciousness is a central idea for DuBois, and it's this notion that blacks in this country are both African American, that's a particular group status, and American, which is a general group status. What that creates is a double consciousness, two ways of seeing yourself in the world. And that is a really important insight in terms of social theory, because there are individuals who see themselves from at least two perspectives. And those individuals are minority group members. Often, white men do not say, well, I see the world as a white man and an American. The idea of being in part of the dominant group means that you do not have to think about how you benefit from power arrangements. Again, the people who understand power the best are usually those who are marginalized. Those marginal people are always seeing themselves from two perspectives, the perspective of their group and that of the dominant group. Last few things here. DuBois said that our economic system seeks out new labor forces that are ready for exploitation. That's kind of paralleling some of Karl Marx's ideas. And one thing that DuBois added, this idea that this can even cross national borders. So why is it that colonial practices often would be white Europeans going to places like Africa, where most people are darker skinned, and that this is something that allows for increased exploitation. DuBois argues that middle-class wages in advanced industrial nations are possible because of other groups being exploited. And race, he says, is something that you really need to take into account when you think about systems of exploitation. In fact, there's a phrase that Kenneth Allen uses in his book, "The Dark Nations and World Capitalism." Capitalism is inherently expansive. It looks for new markets, and that these dark nations are labor forces ready for exploitation. It says here toward the end, prior to modernity, people created group boundaries of exclusion by marking civilized and uncivilized cultures. Race becomes an immutable, unchangeable marker of exclusion and something that can easily be used to lump people together so that they can be exploited. So Gilman and DuBois are theorists that are taking on new and very important areas for social theory today.